Thanks very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. Yeah. The sound's working. Cool. So what I wanted to do today is just give you a very brief overview of RecordPoint, but really from the angle of why some of the approaches I think we've traditionally taken to records management haven't worked particularly well. Dealing with challenges like user adoption, dealing with challenges like managing content in the cloud, and that's obviously an increasing challenge for all of us, and quite a scary one. I mean, talking to a number of people in the networking sessions and also over lunch, is the cloud thing's coming, whether you're ready for it or not. So we'll talk a little bit about how we see that and how we might address that, and there'll be more on that in the session later on this afternoon. So what RecordPoint aims to do, and I quite like this graphic because I think it shows really the challenges we all face as information management and records professionals these days, is the simple thing of solving the complexity of records management. And in our case, it's across SharePoint and Office 365, which is, for those that don't know, is the Microsoft offering which provides SharePoint Online. So essentially it's the SharePoint platform. I mean, as we saw earlier from the previous presentation on how to, I suppose, embed SharePoint and how to deal with those sorts of challenges, really it's about focusing on the end user, and it's about understanding that the needs of the users are different from those of the records team. If you think about it, they're fundamentally different. The reasons why we as records professionals might work with records about things like retention, disposal, managing legal holds, managing FOI requests are fundamentally different from what a user is interacting with that information for. They're using it because they need it for their job. It might sound simplistic and obvious, but if you think traditionally about how we've actually implemented systems, what we either try and do is compromise the records manager's experience, which is really about forcing them to work in a user taxonomy and a user environment, user-focused environment. Or on the other side, we force end users to be records managers. And sadly, they don't want to be. If they did, our jobs would be a heck of a lot easier. So just to talk about those key points and sort of extract a little bit from that complexity in that Rubik's Cube, there are four things I really want to just touch on today in the brief time I've got for this session. Usability, automation, lower total cost of ownership, which I'll touch on briefly, and the final one of compliance anywhere, which I'll explore a lot more in the breakout session later on this afternoon. So usability, really, that's expanding on the point I was making earlier. At the end of the day, why do end users interact with content? It's a part of their business process. It's because they need that information in order to do a particular task, to do their job. The focus of the records managers is fundamentally different. So what we saw in the market is, well, why are we trying to smash these two things together? Why not recognize that the needs of these two groups are fundamentally different and separate those two views? And effectively what RecordPoint does is it's a rules engine that allows you to separate those views, allows a records manager to see a view of content that's based on their needs, classifying records, applying file plan, applying retention, etc. Meanwhile, over on the user side, you can design SharePoint to actually support the business process of the end user. It's all about them. I mean, many of the implementation sessions that I run when we're designing these systems, I don't talk about records at all, because users don't care. What I want to talk about is their business process, what they want to get out of SharePoint, what are the information challenges that they face. And then what we do is we plug in records into the back of that using our rules engine, and that's where the stakeholder group is the records team, where we talk about what their needs and concerns are. But if you can address those sort of selfish needs, you'll end up with a much more successful project in terms of change management, rollout, etc. You're not trying to train people on what they don't want to, or what doesn't really interest them. Really, end users are interested in two things: finding and reusing content, fundamentally. Slightly simplistic, but really when it gets to the core of it, that's what they're bothered about. They're not bothered about these other elements that we're bothered about from a records point of view. So in terms of how we achieve that, we do that via automation. So there's no concept of declaration in RecordPoint or in SharePoint in the case of the end user. They put content into the system, and as we were discussing earlier in the previous sessions, records is taken care of for them, but they're operating in a taxonomy and a structure that makes sense to them. There is no need to apply the file plan in that construct. You can if you want, you could manually create that and manually apply it, but basically we put the file plan over here and we map it using those rules. So the whole idea is you can design SharePoint purely for the needs of those users, not for records. Other elements of automation that sit around that are things like archiving, finalization, and disposal as well. But again, providing an interface for the records managers that's all about them. Lower TCO, just briefly, really what we're doing is leveraging the existing investments that many of you already have in the Microsoft stack. Whether that's because you're licensed for SharePoint already, you're using it already, you might have Office 365 licensing. And that we basically just plug into that environment, and we don't exist without SharePoint or Office 365. The final point, and I'll talk through this in a bit more detail in the later session, is compliance anywhere. Going back to my Rubik's Cube, the landscape has changed fundamentally. We're not just talking about documents and email even these days. We're talking about social media, we're talking about web pages, blogs, wikis, structured data. These are all records, whether we like it or not. So how do we manage that content? Allied to that, and the other sort of, I suppose, twist on the Rubik's Cube is where does that content reside? It doesn't reside just anymore in the filing cabinet. And I'm using filing cabinet metaphor advisedly. Traditional record systems have focused on this idea of the filing cabinet. If I put stuff in the repository, I can control it. Our view of the world is that's changed, and the changing information landscape means it's not a viable approach anymore, and it won't be going into the future. Content will exist everywhere. The trick is to actually be able to control and manage that and have visibility of it, so we as records professionals can control and apply retention to that content wherever it is. I mean, we talked about things like Dropbox and Box earlier. Those are tools that users want to use because they make sense for them. But the issue is we don't have visibility or control of those. If we can apply that policy into those systems, then that sort of gives us what we need from a compliance and a records management point of view. And it also gives the users what they need, which is really the ability to use the tools that make sense to them. So it's a slightly different approach, I suppose. Probably a bit hard to see this slide, I'm afraid, but the idea really here, going back to this usability proposition, is there's two views, no compromises. There's a view for the users and there's a view for the records team, and they're fundamentally different. Same information, we're not duplicating, we're not creating copies of that information, but what we're allowing you to do is design and get round that primary issue with EDRMS deployments, which is change management and training. You can simplify that. Many of our customers, for example, will just have sort of brown bag lunchtime sessions to teach people about SharePoint and their SharePoint and what we've designed for you. Not to teach them about records, not to teach them about the file plan. They don't need to know that stuff. So in terms of how we do this, and I think I've got a little bit more time. How much time have I got? I'm about finished now. Yeah. So how that works is what we're doing is identifying patterns in the structure of the information that we're working with. A bit like the Veritas guys were talking about earlier. So it's identifying structure, it's identifying the content type or the template that the content might have been, or the record might have been created with, and any metadata. So any metadata fields that exist within SharePoint, we can extract that and we can fire rules off that. And if you think about it, with that business-facing metadata and information, there's a heck of a lot of information we can infer from that to drive those rules and apply that retention. So in this example here, I might have a content source of the HR team site, might be a content type or a template, a policy document. And from that I can infer that I need to keep this for 10 years from the last modified date. Now from an end user perspective, they don't see any of that. They don't see the retention schedule. They don't care about the retention schedule. They're just working in their business process, and we're taking that information and applying records off the back of that. Standards are important. There's obviously a few here I've outlined. Some are relevant here in the Scottish market, some are not, some are Australian standards. I'm based in Sydney, Australia for the most part, but the key standards that we really focus on is that ISO 16175 standard, which drives how we implement and how we design RecordPoint to provide that compliance standard and control around that. MOREC 2010 is there as well. We're still in the middle of testing for MOREC 2010, and hopefully we'll get back on the bus with that one once the tests are available to perform again. At the moment, they've been somewhat delayed due to some of the issues with the DLM forum. Finally, the things that we add to SharePoint. I mean, we've already heard about some of the things, the fact that SharePoint is an 80% solution or 86% solution, depending on what you read or hear. So what we're adding to SharePoint really is this advanced rules engine, the ability for you as records professionals to see content no matter where it sits in this centralized dashboard view. We also allow you to manage content, for example, on file shares, but you can see that and control that and manage that content in RecordPoint. Similarly, for content that's in Office 365, you might have a hybrid environment where you've got some stuff in SharePoint Online, some stuff on-prem, some stuff on file shares. We allow you to have visibility and management across that from one central point without having to go into each of those repositories and manage them independently. Look, given the time, I'll probably wrap up there. But look, I hope to see a number of you at the session a little bit later on. Thank you.